Former Pope Benedict has died at the age of 95. A spokesman for the Holy See said the former pontiff died at his home inside the Vatican. His health had been declining in recent days. Benedict's death takes the Vatican into uncharted territory. For centuries, the tolling of the bells in St. Peter's Square has been a signal that a pope has died, and usually other churches in Rome join in. But this is a unique situation, as Benedict is the former pope, and it's unclear exactly what protocols will now follow his death. And to shed some more light on this, our religious affairs correspondent Martin Gack joins me now in the studio. The Pope Emeritus is dead. What might happen next? Any idea?
Well, I mean, obviously this is momentous because the state of play in the Vatican for the last 10 years has been extremely unusual. Two popes, one who is, I mean, obviously no longer the Pope, but nonetheless, even if he didn't hold the official authority, he still held a lot of the moral and the religious authority. I mean, in the sense that he was still being seen as a very important figure, one of the main figures, if not, along with Francis. What this means is that the Vatican is now trying to figure out, as far as we understand, what kind of protocols are going to be followed. Most of the things that would be normally followed, so there is the fisherman's ring, which is the papal ring, which is normally destroyed. Once the Pope dies, it will not happen, obviously, because the Pope Emeritus did not have the ring anymore. Once he actually left the papacy, the ring was taken from him and was actually defaced, actually. Two lines are cut across its face. So there are a lot of things that have to do with, say, the protocol that are no longer apply.
And what was like life for the former pontiff in his final years as former pontiff? Did he play any sort of role in leadership in the church?
I think that it's really quite interesting and quite curious in a sense that he lived a life of seclusion. If not, he was not cloistered, but he was certainly spending most of his days reading and praying and writing. But at the same time, I mean, Pope Francis was often visiting him, and it was made very clear that he still held sort of, you know, a prominent place in understanding the way that the church was to be, sort of its moral guidance and its religious guidance. In a way, he became an elder statesman for the Vatican. This was very unusual with a sitting pope in place.
Absolutely. Okay. Martin Gack, thanks so much for that. Time now to perhaps take a moment to look back at the life of the former pope.
St. Peter's Square in Rome, April 2005.
Cardinale Ratzinger.
Joseph Ratzinger is elected Pope Benedict XVI. The Lord Cardinals have chosen me, a simple and humble worker in the vineyard of the Lord. The new Pope from Germany will make history, but leave a troublesome legacy. Joseph Ratzinger was born in Bavaria in 1927. He was the youngest child of a strictly religious family. He studied and then taught theology, and he ascended the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. In 1977, he was appointed Archbishop of Munich. Shortly afterwards, he was made a cardinal. Then Pope John Paul II brought him to the Vatican, where he was made prefect of the influential Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And when John Paul died in 2005, Ratzinger became his successor. The new pope had a reputation for being quiet, modest, and an arch-conservative. He was also an intellectual and was not a man of grand gestures like his predecessor was. Even so, his first trip to World Youth Day in Germany was deemed a success. Hundreds of thousands came to cheer him. As Pope, he saw himself as the guardian of the faith of the Catholic Church and was a strict advocate of celibacy. He criticised the recognition of same-sex relationships and condemned doctors who performed abortions. Benedict sought dialogue with other religions, seeking contact with the leaders of the Christian Orthodox churches. He also tried to improve relations with Islam and Judaism, but there were also setbacks. For example, when he brought the controversial Society of St. Pius back into the church, even though some of its leaders were anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. But it was the child abuse scandals in the church that cast a dark shadow over Benedict's pontificate. More and more cases involving Catholic clergy came to light in more and more countries. The Pope spoke of his shame and he promised transparency, but his critics said he didn't do enough. Years later, the scandal was to catch up with him again. At the beginning of 2013, Benedict received some cardinals in Rome. It was a routine meeting that became highly controversial because the Pope declared he was stepping down. To steer this church, this ship of Peter, to proclaim the gospel, for this a strength of body and spirit are necessary. A strength that has diminished in me in recent months to such an extent that I must recognize my inability to continue to carry out properly the ministry entrusted to me. The move provoked surprise and dismay. In more than 600 years, no pope had resigned of his own volition. There was plenty of sympathy, though, and hundreds of thousands of people came to Benedict's last audiences. Pope Benedict left office on February the 28th, 2013. A few weeks later, and there was an image for the history books. Two popes standing side by side. The Emeritus Benedict promised obedience to his successor, Pope Francis. In the years that followed, Benedict rarely showed himself in public. But at the beginning of 2022, the report of a new inquiry into the abuse scandal in Germany was published. It incriminated Benedict XVI. During his time as Archbishop, he is said to have accepted a priest, although it was known that the man had abused children on multiple occasions. Benedict had his private secretary read out a letter in which he rejected any personal guilt and offered an apology. As on other occasions, I can only express once again my deep shame, my great pain, and my sincere apologies to all victims of sexual abuse.
Il mio grande dolore e la mia sincera domanda di perdono.
Benedict's critics said he was shirking his responsibility. The Emeritus Pope himself wrote in one of his last letters that he would soon appear before the eternal judge and was confident that he would be forgiven.
And we're going to bring you now straight to Rome, to our correspondent Jack Perrick, who's standing by. Jack, what is the situation there at the Vatican?
What we're seeing now, just in the last half an hour or so, a few more people starting to arrive down at St. Peter's Square, probably a few more than there has been over the last few days. But this has been a couple of days now where the Vatican and indeed Rome and the Catholic faithful have been braced for the news that we got this morning from the Holy See press office that told us that with sorrow, they said, Pope Emeritus Benedict had died at 9:34 this morning in the Mater Ecclesiae monastery within the Vatican, where he's been living ever since he resigned his position there. This was relatively expected in the sense that Pope Francis on Wednesday, during a general audience, asked the people there to pray for the former Pope, who he said was very sick. In the following days, we've had notes out of the Vatican saying that his condition had stabilized, that he was awake and lucid. But as I say, it appears that the former Pope died this morning.
And Jack, you've been talking to people there. You can see what their faces look like. What would you describe the mood as being?
Well, it's a very peculiar and interesting situation, this. He gave up that position in 2013 due to ailing health, and he is 95. So I think there's a sense of sorrow, but also a sense of understanding. I've spoken to many people over the last few days, people from Ireland, people from Spain, people from all over the world who'd come on the news of him falling ill when Pope Francis said that he was very sick back on Wednesday, and arrived just to be here for this moment. And many of them will be here at St. Peter's Square and will remain so probably over the next few days. It's important to say that while Pope Francis enjoys popularity within the believers of the Catholic faith, his sort of progressive version of the papacy wasn't as favourable to some people as the more traditional, more conservative papacy that was held by his predecessor, Pope Benedict. So there are still many Catholics who are very much in favour and really very, very fond of the former Pope.
Well, Jack, can you tell us a little bit more about, I don't know if it's a tension between the two men, but certainly a difference of opinion? Tell me about that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's a peculiar kink in history to have two popes at any time both alive. Normally, the job of the Pope is for life, and the job ends when that Pope dies. This has been a very sort of interesting best part of a decade where the two of them, as I say, there was this sort of progressive, more open, much more sort of scaled back and reserved and austere, perhaps, sense of Pope Francis, where Pope Benedict had this sort of quite traditional set of views around the Catholic Church that was very, perhaps in conflict with the views of his successor. But it is understood that the two men did, while they disagreed on things, had a lot of respect for each other, and that actually Pope Francis did go and visit the monastery where Pope Benedict was living on multiple occasions, and that they were in contact with one another. That isn't to say that Pope Benedict didn't write openly, but pretty much criticising or going against some of the things that Pope Francis was doing and saying. And certainly there were reports, there was a Vatileaks that came out, a sort of leak of documents that came out in 2012, which appeared to suggest that there was some division amongst the cardinals between the former and the sitting Pope as well. So this is a really strange and unprecedented situation that's gone on over the last sort of decade. But now as we end out 2022, this period of history ends, and Pope Francis now is the only Pope alive.
Jack, just briefly, if you don't mind, what can we expect to happen in terms of ceremony and saying goodbye to the Pope Emeritus in the next few days?
So we've heard from the Vatican press office that the body of Pope Benedict will be laying in state from Monday in St. Peter's, so that the Catholic faith, the members of the Catholic faith are able to come and pay their final respects to him. Usually a funeral would happen about 7 days away from now, but they have told us that we will have more information about the funeral arrangements later on today, Nick.
Okay, Jack Perrick in Rome for us. Thanks so much. And to recap our top story, if you're just tuning in, a spokesman for the Vatican has announced that the former Pope, Benedict XVI, has died. We're showing you live pictures of St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. The spokesman said he passed away at his residence in a Vatican monastery just after 9:30 this morning. Benedict had been living in relative seclusion at the monastery ever since he stepped down in 2013. The current pontiff, Pope Francis, visited Benedict at his home earlier this week and said he was very ill and urged people to pray for him. The Vatican had confirmed that Benedict's condition had worsened due to deterioration from advancing age. Pope Benedict was the first German pope in almost 500 years. He was also the first pope in modern times to voluntarily step down. His body is expected to be displayed, as we just heard, on Monday morning at St. Peter's Basilica to allow the faithful to pay their respects. And we're going to come back to our religious affairs correspondent, Martin Gatt. Can you tell our viewers and me a little more about the ideas and the work of the Pope Emeritus?
I think that the Pope, as our correspondent pointed out, I mean, this Pope will be remembered probably as a fairly conservative Pope. I would not say that the most conservative Pope, but certainly a conservative Pope. What is very interesting about Benedict is that as a younger priest, I mean, around the 60s, he actually was a very liberal man who actually was a very strong proponent of the Second Vatican Council, which was actually the big reform of the Church, in which the Church really became, to some degree, I think we can say, democratized, in the sense that, you know, we began to see like the spread of like masses in vernacular languages and so on. this changed around the time that the Paris 68 sort of cultural revolution came into play, in which he began to see a lot of excesses coming from progressivism, and he retreated back to a position that became in the long run much more conservative. I think that the papacy itself is one that mainly will be remembered as a much less engaged from a pastoral point of view. I mean, the church was much more distant from the pews that would be today under Francis. And I think that he showed essentially an incapacity for a very long period of time to deal with what became the most salient issue over the last sort of 3 decades or 5 decades of church life, which was sexual abuse.
Yeah, I think he, in fact, confessed or declared that he had some trouble as a manager and that he was more of an intellectual during his time as Pope, author of more than 60 books, actually a professor of theology who taught at various universities, and then becoming, in 1981, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So kind of the doctrinal watchdog?
Yes, I mean, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is essentially the inheritor of the Inquisition. It's actually the same office, the Holy Inquisition, that became this office. And essentially, it's an office, or it's a congregation that is in charge of revising the relation between practice and doctrine, making sure that people are following doctrine. What is interesting about it is that he became really an expression of the church essentially trying to hold on to its old values and old claims. In 2001, Ratzinger, then still Ratzinger, became basically the person that convinced John Paul II to move cases of sexual abuse from the dioceses to the Vaticans. And he was the one who oversaw this. So in a sense, I think that this is a man who clearly came from an intellectual sort of background. He was a writer, he was a researcher, he was a professor. And I think that this translated into administrative practices that were not necessarily very effective. The fact, however, is that he did come into the space of power, seeing himself as somebody that could solve these issues. I think that ultimately we cannot say that he succeeded at that.
And you were telling me a little bit before we went on air about his ecumenical outreaches and also relativism.
Yes, I mean, so this is a man that clearly had, I mean, as I was pointing out, clearly had a very strong sense of the importance of democratizing the church and bringing people in and hearing multiplicity of views. But I think that he also realized very quickly that there was a limit to that. And it had a lot to do, I mean, from an intellectual point of view, with the idea of truth. People believed that there was no, I mean, this is something that we saw increasingly since the 60s, the idea that truth was something blasé, that there was no longer truth, that there were many truths, different people had different truths. And this was completely antithetical to his position. His idea was that, in fact, there was truth. The truth had been actually made present in the flesh of man, and so on and so forth in theological terms. This essentially, which might sound very abstract, meant very, very strong political and ideological battles.
It sounds very relevant almost today when people speak of the post-truth world, and I have my facts, your facts.
Yes, so this was a man who had absolutely no time for sort of many different facts on the same matter. So he was happy with having, I think that the point is that he was happy to see people with different opinions, but he did not believe that people had the right to their own facts. And I think that this is an important intuition that carried into the way in which he understood the church. The church was here not to basically simply bring different truths into the fold, but really help people with different opinions come closer to the truth, because this is how the church understood happiness and the good life to be. And obviously, I mean, in the current political and ideological climate, especially in the West, this provoked a lot of conflict. I mean, this was bound to happen. I think that what we saw is that in the process of establishing that kind of idea, he lost a lot of people along the way. And as the church began to lose moral authority because of sexual abuse scandals, because of the Vatican bank scandal in which narco-trafficking money and mafia money was found, and so on and so forth, people began to think, well, maybe there is a truth, but perhaps the Vatican under this Pope is not in the best position to actually bring that about.
And we have time for one more question before we go to another guest who's joining us from Rome. What do you think this Pope will be remembered for in 100 years' time?
I think this Pope will be remembered for the massive sexual abuse scandals across the globe, and essentially a very timid approach to actually trying to solve it and readdress what were massive, massive crimes committed at a global scale. It's sad to say, because I think that there are very positive things that really were pushed and attempted, but I think that those things pale in comparison to the scale of what the sexual abuse scandal is and has been.
Okay, DW's religious affairs correspondent Martin Gack, thank you for those insights. And we return to Rome to speak with author and journalist Philip Willen. Philip, can you tell us what are the next steps in this situation? Quite unusual for the Catholic Church.
The body of the Pope Emeritus will lie in state in St. Peter's Basilica from Monday, and it's expected that his funeral will take place within the space of about a week. The Vatican does have to somewhat reinvent the procedures for the funeral and burial of a Pope Emeritus, because clearly this has not happened for 600 years. The assumption is that he will be saluted in a manner befitting a Pope, but clearly things will be slightly different, because this is not a reigning Pope who has died, but a Pope who has been in retirement for 10 years. So clearly they will model the procedures on what would happen in the case of the death of a reigning Pope, but things will be slightly different. And of course, we will have an already reigning Pope in charge of celebrating the funeral for his predecessor, again without precedent.
Absolutely extraordinary. I think our viewers were just looking briefly at some pictures of the former Pope's hometown. We'll be joining our correspondent there in the hours to come. Let me come back to you, Mr. Willen, with another question. Former Pope Benedict became the first Pope to resign in 600 years. What, in your opinion, do you think he will be remembered for?
Well, I think that resignation is probably what most people will remember him for. In his case, it was a particularly painful choice because, as has been mentioned, he was a very conservative theologian, and clearly he came from a wing of the church which would tend to believe that the papacy is for life. There's no possibility of resigning, and I think many of his Conservative supporters were very taken aback when he did announce his resignation. And I think probably he himself would have wrestled with that problem, knowing that it's not the kind of thing that people expected from him, not the kind of thing that he would naturally have approved of himself. Mm-hmm. But the problems of the church at that time, the scandals that were lapping around the Vatican, were really just too much for him. I think both from the point of view of his physical vigor at that point, but also I think from the point of view of his mental strength. He wasn't someone who was a strong, sort of domineering leader who relished a fight. He was someone who liked quiet study and intellectual pursuits. So I think he was very realistic there in recognizing that the problems were such and his strength was so diminished, he simply couldn't cope at that point.
Could you help us, Mr. Willen, understand what his mindset must have been when he decided to resign? What kind of charges were being laid against him with regards to the sexual abuse scandal? In action, what were the specific things that he might have been hearing that might have pushed him to make that decision?
Well, I think the period leading up to his election as Pope had already shown that this hidden scandal of sex abuse by priests throughout the world was coming to the fore, increasingly being exposed in the press. And I think Benedict, as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, had already started to try and deal with this problem under Pope John Paul II. But Pope John Paul, partly given his experience in communist Poland, was not very sensitive to this subject. And when he resigned as Pope himself, there was a feeling that the Vatican was riven by feuding factions. There were financial scandals involving the Vatican Bank, and a feeling that there was a state of chaos and anarchy within the Church, and that really was just too much for Benedict, as he recognized in 2013. And I think it was an act of humility and realism when he issued his statement that he was stepping down from the papacy.
Okay, author and journalist Philip Willen in Rome, thanks so much for those insights.